Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, What Will Earned Value Do for Me? My name is Mary Major, and I'm a Senior Principal Solutions Engineer with Deltek. But before we begin, I have a few administrative items to note. For the best webinar experience, please use Google Chrome or Firefox. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box anytime during the presentation. We will address as many questions as we can at the conclusion of the webinar, and any questions left unanswered will be addressed individually offline following today's presentation. Resources, including the presentation slides, are available for you to download in the Resources panel on your screen. All widgets can be resized to fit your computer screen. You will also receive an on-demand recording of today's webinar within 24 hours after the webinar ends. Today's presentation is a part of Deltek's GovCon University webinar series, designed to help government contractors gain greater knowledge and insights into important industry topics. We will be coming out with a variety of topics throughout the remainder of 2022 as part of this special series, so be sure to check out deltek.com events and webinars for future events. So with that, I'll go ahead and dive right in. So the topics I'm going to go through today, a brief introduction of myself, and then go into an earned value overview, some reporting and compliance items, project lifecycle, and then how you can incorporate earned value into existing processes. And then we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. Again, my name is Mary Major. I'm a Senior Principal Solutions Engineer with Deltek. I've been with Deltek a little over 6 years, and before that I worked in the aerospace and defense industry for more than 27 years. So first of all, what is earned value? And very simply, earned value is a project management methodology that integrates scope, schedule, and cost. It's a framework to monitor scope, schedule, and cost that provides an objective measure of project status. An objective is really the key there. We want to try to get the subjective status out of those assessments as much as possible. And it also includes a set of standard terminology and calculations used across industries, which makes it easy when you use one of the earned value terms. It's well known as to what it means. Does it mean something else in different industries? So the core earned value concepts, like I said a moment ago, the three pillars of earned value are scope, schedule, and cost. Scope, the product or services to be completed or delivered. What's the goal of the project, or maybe a portion of the project? Schedule, what's the time frame start to finish? And then the cost, what labor, material, subcontractors are required. And then we bring all of those items together in an integrated fashion so that there's a lot of overlap between these three elements. And in the next handful of slides, we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail and and how they relate to one another. So what's the first thing you want to do? You have a new contract, or the contract award is imminent. You're ready, set, go. You want to hit the ground running. Well, pretty much the first thing you want to do is establish the scope. And most likely you have a pretty good handle on that scope to begin with. You've probably been through a proposal process, maybe some fact finding and negotiations as well. But it's a good time to brush up and review that scope again. Um, and it can include, I have a list here of pretty much anything. You know, regardless of the industry, you need to capture that entire scope. Could be development of a new product or software, building or delivering a new product, or maybe something you've been making for 20 plus years, or maybe it's installation or support at a facility. And maybe it includes some post-delivery support. You want to make sure that everyone on the team is on the same page in regards to project scope. Um, and certainly the best practice is to verify that the entire scope is accurately defined in a statement of work. I'm going to say that again. It's very important to make sure that the entire scope is accurately defined in the statement of work. So then the next thing is to define, okay, the work breakdown structure. What are the different pieces? How am I going to build this thing out, this project? And here's just a few examples. On the left is a tabular like spreadsheet view, and then the typical view over on the right that shows the project structure, in a more hierarchical structure there. I only have, a portion of the WBS in this example, but you have your top level, and then you have multiple levels. And this example has up to 3 or 4 levels. WBS is product specific. It every element deals with a different product or service depending on the program. And then you're going to also need to organize your organization. What does your organization look like? Here's just a very high level example. Your company and then some functional areas. And that may be sufficient. You may, organize your work just at the engineering level, manufacturing, so on and so forth. You may have maybe in engineering, you break it down a little bit more detailed into maybe systems engineering or mechanical engineering. Manufacturing may break down into multiple levels as to where program management may be at that higher level. Then you're going to define your control accounts, which are typically that, integration of your WBS and your OBS. Where do the two meet for making a particular product or a piece of a project? Who's going to be responsible for that? And that's the level where you will manage the project. So at that level, you'll have budget, you'll track performance, actual costs, and forecast will all be aligned at that control account level. Some things to consider, particularly in companies where you have a matrix organization, there may be several functional areas within one portion of the scope. Who owns it? I definitely don't want to just create additional control accounts for the sake of, functional responsibility. An example would be, maybe in manufacturing, you have quality inspectors that are on the floor in the manufacturing area. So they're working hand in hand with the manufacturing technicians. You may not need to separate out a second control account for the quality aspect of that manufacturing product. They're there hand in hand, working side by side with the manufacturing technicians, even though they're in a different functional area. It may make sense to just keep at one control account. You also want to take time to think about day-to-day or month-to-month effort when defining control accounts. Just like with that quality effort, if you have, for example, if you have more control accounts, that's more touch points on a weekly or monthly basis. Different things have to be statused or updated or forecast reviewed. So sometimes keeping it simple makes sense. And then the last thing I would say, to take into consideration when you're defining control accounts is the data available at that control account level? If data from your other systems, and I'm thinking primarily your financial systems or maybe procurement where you're getting purchase order information, or name runs for from time collection, are you able to aggregate the data to that level? That really becomes important. Um, you know, it takes time. At the end of the day, if you ask someone who's managing a project, if they have to take the data from the lowest detail level and roll it up to that control account level, it takes time. And it may not seem like a lot, but when you're talking 5 or 10 minutes and someone may have, a dozen or 2 dozen control accounts to review, it ends up being a significant amount of time. So if data is not available at that level, it's certainly worth talking to maybe someone in your finance organization or your IT organization to maybe help build some reports that aggregate the data to that control account level to make things a little bit easier for your managers. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a schedule. And a schedule is the logical plan to complete the scope. It includes logic between various activities, the duration, and the relationship. Can I not start this until this other item is finished, or can I start these two activities at the same time? And as you see, having a schedule that helps integrate your scope and the schedule. The next piece is cost. Resource loading the schedule defines the basis for the budget. Typically in the schedule, you wouldn't necessarily have all of your rates and factors, but you would have hours and maybe direct dollars for non-labor. That is certainly the best way to do that, and helps keep things integrated, because then the next thing you'll do is then you'll integrate that schedule with your time-phased resource assignments into a cost engine where it's going to apply the appropriate rates and factors to build out that budget. And then once you integrate that in to a cost engine, like for example, Deltek Cobra, it's going to provide you a profile that looks something like this. And just in this graph, and we'll see this same graphic chart in the next several slides, the bars represent monthly values, and they relate to the axis, the primary axis on the left side of the graphic. And then the line is a cumulative value that is represented by the secondary axis over on the right side. So now I've brought in my schedule into my cost engine, and now I have a budget. So these are generally things you do anyway when planning a new project. You time phase the data. You want to look at that data over time, make sure you have appropriate resources to complete the work scope. Once you have your budget, Then you're into the execution phase, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the project life cycle in a few minutes. But then on a routine basis, you're going to go through and assess your project progress. Periodic, typically monthly, you're going to assess performance. And this is where that schedule comes back into play. As you maintain that schedule with things like actual start and finish dates, percent complete, or maybe new expected dates for things that have shifted, it's going to update that status for you. And then it plays into the forecast as well, because it's moving those activities to the appropriate time period. But then here, we bring that data into our cost engine. You may also have input from other sources, like maybe from MRP. You may get information on work order percent complete or purchase order receipts or something like that. Record actual costs. That you're certainly doing pretty much on every project that you execute as well. And the things we're looking for, typically hours, direct cost, and overheads. And it is important to look at those things separately. Is if you have those items, you can identify variances in a little bit more detail. And I'll give you a quick example before I move on to the next chart. You could have, let's say, you have budgeted 100 hours for a particular task. And we'll say that 100 hours is, I'm just going to keep it simple, $10,000. Well, actuals come in and you've spent your 100 hours, maybe, exactly, but your direct cost is maybe 12,000. Okay, so then that would lead you to believe that, okay, my variance is, I'm using someone, a more experienced, a higher rated person than what we had planned. Likewise, if that same 100 hours, maybe my direct dollars came in at the 10,000 as expected, but maybe my overheads were planned at $20,000, and maybe my overheads ended up coming in at 25,000. That case, that's an overhead variance. There's really not much that the project manager can do. That's more, but leadership needs to be aware of those variances. So it's really important to make sure your analysts or project managers have this level of detail to be able to do an assessment of their project on a periodic basis. And then you're going to update your forecast. And this is most certainly something that every company, every project has to do periodically. The frequency may vary between monthly and maybe annually. Small projects, you may only have an initial plan, an initial forecast. Large projects, you may do them more frequently. Projects that are having any sort of financial issues may have to do them more frequently. But these are things that you do. Again, also things you do in earn value, just may have to do them a little bit differently. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But again, the methods may vary from a bottoms-up calculation where a project manager is going in and assessing each and every activity, or it may be based on project performance. And then again, forecasts are generally updated at that control account level. Again, that is that control point where everything aggregates at that level. And then, and this would generally be on a monthly basis, you're going to calculate and assess variances. So schedule variance, that is a typical earned value terminology, and it is performed value less the budgeted value. And on this graphic, my plan, my budget is the blue line. What I've actually performed, or my earned value, is that green line. So that delta between those two is my schedule variance. Does everything at those budgeted rates, that you don't have a budget, or excuse me, a rate variance. Likewise, your cost variance is my earned value, or my performed value, less my actual costs. And then your at complete is your EAC less your total budget. Typical earned value calculations, these are the primary ones. There are a few others that look at metrics. These are the primary terms that are used. I'm going to jump into reporting and compliance just a little bit. If anything, particularly as you're looking at new contracts, maybe a proposal, buzzwords or terms to keep an eye out for to understand what they mean. So first I want to talk about some reporting thresholds. So for DoD and NASA contracts, generally there's a $20 million threshold for earned value reporting. If your project's over 20 million, you're going to have to provide earned value reporting. Contracts less than 100 million, you're going to be required to comply with the guidelines. And I'm going to talk about the guidelines in a few minutes, but you don't need an earned value, an approved EVMS system. Contracts over 100 million require compliance with these guidelines and an approved EVMS system or a plan to get to approval is required. DOE contracts are similar. If it's less than 100 million, you must employ an EVMS compliance system, but there's no formal certification. May require surveillance on an exception basis. And my guess would be if projects having issues, maybe overcost, behind schedule, that's when that surveillance piece would probably come into play. In contracts over 100 million, there is a formal compliance review process to certify EVMS system, and there would be periodic surveillance. So you may have seen this term recently, IPMDAR, IMPDAR, and there's a DID reference, DI MGMT 81861C. That's the current data item description reference for earned value reporting. And it's all encompassing of both cost or contract and schedule data. And it had two separate pieces. When you submit a contract performance data set, or a CPD, and a schedule performance data set, SPD. And those are delivered to your customer in a JSON format. So all the data is included in those JSON files, and generally you're not required to submit like an Excel or a PDF version of the tabular data. And then there's the older IPMR with its reference. It was 81861A. Formats 1 through 5 are your typical tabular cost data, and that Schedule 6 is a schedule format, and then there was a format 7 for an annual time-phased report, and the deliverables there are in an XML format. So if you see a proposal or a contract with either of those terms, this is what they would be expecting as far as deliverables. And you'll certainly, if you see reference to ANSI EIA 748, ANSI American National Standards Institute, EIA Electronic Industries Alliance, it's a standard set of guidelines. That's maintained or coordinated with the government through the NDIA, and particularly their Program Management Systems Committee. DECM, you gotta love that one. When you have an acronym with acronyms built into it, DECM stands for the DCMA EVMS compliance metrics, and it's a series of data-driven metrics that actually look at the data rather than just the tabular information. And then there's the Project Assessment and Reporting System, PARS. That one would come into play on DOE projects. And the format to deliver that is a CPP, or a contractor project performance format. So if you see any of those terms, would certainly suggest earned value. So you might want to dig a little bit deeper. Now, I mentioned the 32, or the guidelines. There are 32 of them. They are broken down into these 5 areas: organization and planning, scheduling, and budgeting, accounting considerations, analysis and management reports, and then revisions and data management. I just want to talk about these a little bit because I know a lot of people hear, oh, earned value, they think it's complicated, it's going to take a lot of time. And there are parts of it that, that it does take time to do some of these things. That said, many of them you're doing anyway. You're going to have some sort of WBS, some sort of structure in which to organize your work, to issue charge numbers. It's the way things happen. Same deal. You have overheads that you keep track of, and a person that's responsible to maintain and track those overheads. That's EVMS guideline number 32. Down in the green section for planning, scheduling, and budgeting, item number 7 in particular, you certainly identify what products you're making or services you'll be delivering, and what milestones associated with those. You're going to define a time phase budget, and guideline number 9, significant cost elements. If there's something significant on your work, you're going to flag that. You're going to know that that's a critical item. You're going to set overhead budgets for the organizations, and you're going to define a management reserve. You get a contract with a cost of $100 million, or let's keep it simple, maybe $10 million. You're certainly going to hold back some MR, management reserve, for known unknowns. Something's going to happen. You just don't know what it is yet, but you're going to hold something back for that. Over on the accounting considerations, you most certainly record your direct costs. Anyone involved in government contracting is going to do that. And then you're going to be able to slice that data into, well, you should be able to slice and organize that data into your WBS or your OBS. Again, that's where up front on that organization phase, thinking about charge numbers and, and where I want to set these things up to get the right combination. You don't want too many, but you also don't want too few. Analysis and management reports. These are certainly other things that you do on a routine basis. Periodic control account sums. You're going to look at data, in this case, at that control account control point. Look at your budget, performance, and actuals. And your EAC. You're going to look at variances. You're going to look at indirects. Am I having any variances there? And then number 26, a manager action plan. Where there's an issue, there's going to be a plan to fix it, a corrective action. Same thing with EAC revisions. If there's an issue that's going to drive cost up or maybe down, you're going to update your EAC accordingly. Those are things that you're required to do anyway. And then, of course, the revisions and data management is, how are you going to handle change, contract change, those sorts of things. And this is probably one of the things that's the most complex for some folks to wrap their head around is that part of it. But really, once you start tracking your changes and have a good control system in place, it does make life a lot easier. Things are less likely to get missed when you have a formal process in place. So that if you've added scope, you know to also add it to your EAC. I want to talk a little bit about the project lifecycle. So this is from the PMBOK, their project life cycle definitions. These are the five stages: initiation, plan, execution, monitor and control, and then close out. Monitor and control is a little bit larger because really that's where we're mostly talking about here. In reality, the execution box could probably be as large as well because that's where you're doing most of your work. That's where you're spending most of your time. Arrows go both directions all the way up through monitor and control because things happen. You may get a contract change. That piece of it, you'd start back in through the initiation phase. And in the initiation phase, talking about things like defining your scope, some high-level budgets, and communicating with stakeholders, making sure they're all on board. In the plan section or phase of the life cycle, you're defining deliverables, detailing that budget, and developing PM plans. And by PM, program manager plans, talking, quality plan, a manufacturing plan, a procurement plan, those sorts of items that are required either directly on the contract or maybe within your company. So those are things that you're typically doing anyway. Then we get to the execution phase, and that's where you're executing. You're building product, you're designing parts, writing lines of software code, whatever it may be, and then you communicate. You communicate with leadership, you communicate within the organization. Those are certainly things that you're doing anyway. There are issues that pop up. You're communicating those issues to get more resources, get schedule relief, whatever it may be. In the monitor and control phase of the project lifecycle, that's where you're doing your typically monthly earned value analysis, looking at those variances, looking for trends, financial reports, updating plans, and by plans that would be your program management plans. Maybe something happened or a contract mod that you need to make an update, so you would update those there. And then change control would most likely be initiated from that point. Again, depending on how your business works, you may go back through that initiation phase for significant changes, or it may be something that's less complex and it doesn't require too much effort to incorporate that. And then the last phase is closeout. Probably the most ignored phase of a project lifecycle. And I say that from years and years of experience working, particularly the A&D industry within areas of finance. The project's done or just about done. The project managers have, and your key team members have been moved on to other projects. So, they're not too interested in this one anymore. As far as they're considered, it's done. But there are certainly important things to do that can help you for the next proposal that you work on this product or service. And those include just cleaning up your financials. Do you have any, adjustments you have to finalize? Archiving any of the project data that you may want to use later on. Cleaning up inventory. I'm going to say that one again, cleaning up inventory. If you have residual inventory on a contract, and again, it varies depending on cost reimbursable or fixed price type contracts as to who owns those, any residual material. So those, so you have to consider that. But do I have a follow-on contract? Can I move this residual material to the follow-on contract that's maybe under the same prime contract number umbrella, which may mean I have to buy less on the next contract. And you may be able to, edge out a little bit more profit on the project that you're closing out. And lessons learned. Lessons learned is very important. And that can go from, anything of dealing with items that maybe risks that were realized, maybe risks or issues that popped up that were unexpected, to document those so you can plan for those the next time around. Then, how do you incorporate EV into existing processes? And I'm just going to talk about a few processes, in those that I truly feel you're doing this stuff anyway. EAC, estimate at complete. Without a doubt, that is a standard project process. Project managers are going to be required to assess the EAC, estimate at complete, for their project. They need to predict the project cost, if anything, to be able to predict the project profit. Again, depending on the contract type, fixed price versus cost plus, how that prediction works is a little bit different, but they need to know their cost to be able to project their at complete position. Timing may vary and frequency, but it's certainly something that's done. And again, different types of EACs, a bottoms up, tops down, or a statistical where the calculations are based on your project performance. And you may have others based on maybe work standards or production history. Labor forecasting. Again, certainly something that is done almost every company. Questions like, do I have the right staff? Can I execute projects to fulfill my contractual obligations with my current staff? Do I have more work planned over the next few months than I have staff to execute? And how much delay will my contracts incur if I don't have adequate staff? This is a lot of these questions can be answered by having that resource loaded schedule and being able to look across your projects at those resource requirements. Again, comes into play with earned value. You need those time-phased resource assignments, having them in your schedule kind of helps this process along. You don't have to start from scratch when it's time to do an annual or semi-annual labor forecast. And then the ever popular sales or revenue projections. Let's plan a forecast for this year. What about next year? The real critical part for me is there alignment between these three reports or financial activities, your EAC, sales forecast, labor forecast, and or sales revenue projection. Disconnects will occur when those reports or elements are generated independently. In fact, the base data for these reports or activities is highly correlated and really should be the same basic data set. I've seen it too often where you get analysts who are working on a sales projection and they're working on labor forecast and they're using completely different data sets, which just makes their job 3 times harder. Using earned value has all of these different pieces in one logical engine to be able to do all of these things efficiently from the same data source, from the same, you're speaking of the same data. It's one source of the truth through all levels of management. And then of course there are project reviews. They may be more informal, and the frequency may vary, but typically they're going to involve scope, schedule, and cost, which are core earned value elements or principles. And status, that you'll provide some sort of project status, a percent complete. Use some earned value standard calculations rather than trying to come up again with something else completely standalone. Use that one set of data to drive all of these different program management activities. So what can you do? How can you get these things lined up or synced? First of all, are the due dates, are they out of sync with the data? Are you being asked to provide a sales forecast when you don't have your last month's data yet? Or you being same thing for labor forecast. Ask questions. The due dates may just be arbitrary based on when somebody's like, oh, this looks like a good week of the monthly cycle to do that. And often if you could explain why you like something changed a little bit to be able to be more efficient, people often listen. Align those data sources, scope, schedule, and cost. And I've mentioned it a couple times, start with a schedule. Even all the larger scheduling tools, Microsoft Project includes earned value calculations. So you can do a lot of this without having to necessarily go out and buy more software right away. Almost everyone has Microsoft Project. You can start out using that, something like that, just to get a feel for what kind of data you could get. And now we're at the Q&A section. But before I get into your questions, just a few closing remarks. You will receive an on-demand recording of today's webinar via email within 24 hours. If we were not able to get to any of your specific questions, we'll follow up directly with you offline. Please fill out the short survey you will see at the conclusion of this webinar. And please visit deltek.com to view additional webinars in the GovCon University series. Thank you and have a nice day. On to the questions.